So, good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure and my privilege to welcome you all here for this discussion on the fragility and the prevention of a scorched planet. And the irony of doing it over kava is not entirely lost on me. But thank you all for being here. I'm joined tonight by a stellar panel to discuss the discrepancies and the challenges of commitments made by parties to channel $100 billion annually towards developing economies in aid of climate action and investments. The pledged public amount of this $100 billion annually is estimated to stand somewhere between 30 and 50 billion. And the estimates of financial flows of this touted 100 billion are anywhere between 17 and 61 billion. I'm getting these numbers from the OECD, Bloomberg, Climate Funds Update, Climate Policy Initiative, and WRI. One of the many reasons that finance flows of this sort are really hard to estimate is because the climate architecture, as well as the tenets that qualify money to be climate finance, are quite fragmented. But there are larger challenges in deploying this money. We'll get to those shortly. But first and foremost, let's take a step back and recognize that climate change is real, it's happening, and it is a threat multiplier. With climate migration becoming almost a norm today, do we need a shift in the narrative that the world is following on climate change today? Do we need to move to securitization of climate change so that people take this threat more seriously? I'd first like to turn to Ms. Cleo Pascal. Ms. Pascal is an associate fellow in the Energy, Environment, and Resources Department at the Chatham House in France. She's a 2015 Trudeau Visiting Fellow at Cerium and adjunct faculty, at the Department of Geopolitics at Manipal University. So, Ms. Pascal, how is this lack of financial outflow from developed economies hurting those that are trying to be on a trajectory of cleaner development? And how is it impacting the larger climate regime where the seriousness of the challenge is necessarily not being taken as such? And I ask this especially since a certain speech was made last year in a rose garden by Mr. Donald Trump. Ms. Cleo.
Hi. I'm amazed any of you showed up. Thank you very, very much. I look at geostrategic issues, and the way that I do geostrategic assessments is to look at geopolitical change, geoeconomic change, and geophysical change. That includes changes caused by climate change. And when you put the three together, you can see that all systems are in high flux, and the geophysical change is often undervalued. So in terms of thank you very much, the consequences of inadequate climate financing and how that could affect geostrategic alignments, I'm going to use the case study of, in the Pacific, a country called Kiribati, which has a very small population, has a population of about 100,000 people. But because every island can get a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, it has an exclusive economic zone the size of India. The size of the land mass of India is the size of Kiribati in the Pacific, and it's a highly strategic location. It's such a strategic location that when China had relations with Kiribati, they set up a tracking station to monitor the US activity in the Marshall Islands to the north of it. The US wasn't that delighted, and so they asked Kiribati perhaps they could shut down that base. Kiribati changed its alignment to Taiwan, shut down the base, the Taiwanese came in, the Chinese moved out. Kiribati is one of the countries that's threatened by rising sea levels, and the population may have to move. It's very possible that one of the places they'll move to is Fiji. In fact, they bought a lot of land in Fiji already. The Fijians have a very close relationship with China. So the question is, if you combine the three, the geopolitics, where China is very aggressively moving into the region and is looking for strategic positioning, the geoeconomics, where they've created a geoeconomic relationship between China and Fiji, which gives it a lot of power, and the geophysical change, where Kiribati starts to disappear and the population has to move, do you have a situation where China can leverage that relationship with Fiji and the population displacement to go back in to recreate a much larger base in the Kiribati exclusive economic zone? So from a geostrategic assessment position, this is not minor at all. This could really shift balance of power in critical positions. It could recreate strategic positioning in zones that we know are highly active already. And it's not often being included into the strategic assessments. So when we think about Kiribati, we think about poor population movement and all that sort of stuff, and it's very heartbreaking and all that kind of things, but we also need to add into this component the critical strategic assessments that are going into a geophysical change caused by climate change. I can talk a little bit about some of the other issues, but maybe we'll do it on the second round during the questioning. Thank you.
Sure. Moving to the 100 billion again, and since that is the theme for the evening for us today, geostrategic implications mean a lot, and maybe investments flowing via that route is something that needs to be looked at in greater detail, and that's what we'll come back to. But in the Paris Agreement, for all of the follies that it brought with it, right, it was still a milestone for the international climate regime. It brought together governments who for the first time agreed that they did in fact want to curtail climate change, limit temperature increase to under 2 degrees. It created frameworks, albeit empty ones so far, on finance, technology, and on capacity building. But one of the most significant things that happened as a result of the Paris Agreement was that it recognized the role of the private sector and non-state actors. It led to recognition of the groundswell of climate action and investments that are under play today. For India and a lot of countries like India that stand at the forefront of this climate action and investment, renewable energy is a key sector. India's domestic renewable energy target has led to its international leadership position politically by way of the International Solar Alliance, which was recently instituted. I'm proud that my organization, the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, has played an important role in giving birth to the International Solar Alliance, and we're now partnering with the Climate Bonds Initiative and several other stakeholders at the request of 17 countries who want to set up a de-risking instrument to mitigate the challenges that they face in luring investments into solar. But no one is more well-poised than Mr. Werlings to talk about ISA and renewable energy as a vehicle of sustainable economic development. Mr. Werlings is one of the founding flag bearers of ISA. He's with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Development in France, and is also the focal point for the International Solar Alliance there. Mr. Werlings.
Okay, thank you very much, Shika. It's a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. During the preparation for COP21, I was indeed responsible for negotiations with India, and it is in this context that we set up this alliance. So, as you know, the Prime Minister of India and the French President have launched an initiative that addresses or tries to address the very challenges that you mentioned, Shika. And this initiative is the International Solar Alliance, and its primary objective is to reduce the cost of finance for solar and to attract affordable finance at scale for solar energy in countries with abundant solar resource. So it focuses on solar energy as a starting point, but the efforts undertaken by its member, if successful, can certainly be replicated in many other sectors and areas. So the analysis of the situation is exactly what you have said. Now, what is the answer? The answer broadly is countries with abundant solar resource can better access affordable finance at scale if they act as a group through aggregation and harmonization of their demand for solar finance. So an international treaty has been developed along those lines, and 48 countries so far have signed this treaty. And the very guiding principle of this treaty is that member states will take coordinated action to better harmonize and aggregate their demand for solar finance which also includes the demand for de-risking instruments and mechanisms. And I remember in May in 2017, on the occasion of the signing of the agreement by several African countries, the Minister for Finance of the government of India said, well, this alliance is not just about signing an agreement, it's really about opening a new chapter in the economic history of the world. Well, so how do we get there? Now if we go more into the specifics, the efforts of the countries of the Solar Alliance rest on 3 pillars. Those 3 pillars are closely interconnected and of equal importance. The first pillar is about policy frameworks. And you know, at the beginning of December, there was here in Delhi the first meeting of the representatives of the countries of the Solar Alliance. And what do they say? Many of those countries say exactly this. Well, we know that a good contractual and regulatory framework is a priority to attract investment. But we do not have the lawyers, we do not have the financial capacities, we do not have the local capacities to design optimal regulatory frameworks. And so quite often we are being arm-twisted by foreign actors who have the capacities to devise contracts that are along their interests. And so those countries say, why don't we develop common instruments that will help strike a better balance between the interests and the needs of the various stakeholders? So there is this strong need or demand by countries with abundant solar resource to benefit from collective instruments. So the work has begun to design common guidelines for power purchase agreements as a starting point. And those common procurement rules could provide the market with the size and the certainty that will help massively reduce the costs. So this is the first pillar. The second pillar is about de-risking. More and more de-risking instruments are available on the market. However, for many countries with abundant solar resource, it is difficult to access those instruments. So as you mentioned, Shika, 17 countries of the Solar Alliance have commissioned a study to define and structure a common risk mitigation mechanism to access de-risking instruments through a common platform. And this common risk mitigation mechanism would also provide for a one-stop shop that would mitigate all key risks of taker, foreign exchange, and political risks. And the CWW as well as the CII have played an important role in the preparation for this study. And the concept has been shortlisted by the Green Climate Fund for potential funding among more than 300 proposals. And this could happen in the first semester of this year. So which goes back to the question, what can developed countries can do? And here there is an essential role for them to play in providing the guarantee instruments and the sovereign guarantees that will help de-risk the investment and catalyze private capital towards developing countries. So we can discuss more. The third pillar is about a more balanced and structured dialogue with investors, including on difficult matters such as risk analysis practices and criteria, actual performance data, because we lack data. We have very little track record regarding investment in renewables in developing countries. And also capacity building for asset managers, not for the developing countries. And an initiative is underway from those Solar Alliance countries to initiate this dialogue and capacity building effort. So just to conclude, as you know, in 2 months' time, there will be in New Delhi a first meeting of those countries at the head of state level. And the French president will travel to India on this occasion. And this is a rare opportunity to to take stock of the progress and to make decisions. This is also a rare opportunity to bring around the same table not only the governments, but representatives of all three categories of stakeholders who are involved in the process: the investors, all the entities that can contribute to the guarantee mechanism, and of course the companies who will develop and operate the projects on the ground. And if we can align the interests of all four categories of stakeholders, then maybe we can make bold decisions, including regarding the launch of a pilot project to fast track and deploy 15 gigawatt of solar at very low cost, very affordable finance across 20 countries over the next 5 years. So I'll stop here and happy to take your questions.
Thank you. The International Solar Alliance is indeed a story of partnerships and alliances to meet developing country needs and ambitions by luring international investments. Having said that, solar is touted to be our big story as well as India, beyond the International Solar Alliance. The recent dip in the tariffs was something that was well celebrated. My colleagues at CEW, however, went a step further to look into what those tariffs were comprised of. And on closer analysis, they found that almost 60% of that tariff was born out of the cost of finance. Now, internationally in developed economies, debt usually is available at the rate of 3 to 6%. In India, it has only now dipped down to 10%. For infrastructure ambitions, for clean development ambitions to be met, India and the likes of India will need a lot more debt to flow into our countries. So moving to Mr. Sanyal, who's the Principal Economic Advisor to the Ministry of Finance in India, and Mr. Sinha, Chairman and CEO of Renew Power, if I may. On the notion of enabling environments, what can countries like India do to, one, assert their investment needs, two, attract these investments, and three, hold to account what has been promised internationally?
Well, as you yourself pointed out, holding to account what has been promised internationally hasn't been a great success, as you may have noticed. Paris pledged about 100 billion, and as you pointed out, maybe 30 to 40 have been pledged so far properly, and even out of that, a tiny trickle would have actually been coughed up, and one could argue even in those cases that money would have made its way to the recipient anyway for other reasons. So I'm afraid that's not been a great, so far, not really moved the needle. And I can say similar things about things like technology transfer and so on. Having said that, the Indian government does take the whole matter quite seriously. We have a fairly serious solar effort, which Sumant will talk about shortly. But we are also doing other things. It's not just about solar. We have, as you may know, the world's largest LED lighting project. And amazingly, within a period of having almost no LED lighting industry, we have essentially created one of the world's largest ones. And we, in fact, are spreading this is actually far from just being something for ourselves. It's actually now a globally competitive industry. And, and many others are adopting similar schemes. And we are providing both technology and exports on the basis of this. But we are doing this, again, electric cars, something that we have adapted quite strongly recently. Many of the new cars the government will be buying are going to become electric. We can already see that. I live in a government colony not far from here, and there are already quite a few electric cars driving around. Mine isn't yet, but I'm sure I will get one shortly whenever it turns around. So a lot of effort is being put into first order efforts in India. But there are a large number of second order issues. Let me give you one example. India is currently thinking through its a completely brand new national urban policy, which will come out at some point this year. And it completely rethinks our cities, fundamentally. Essentially expunging the ghost of Le Corbusier finally, hopefully. But the main point is that we will embed in these codes a completely different way of thinking about cities, particularly about density. People in India tend to confuse density with crowding. They're totally different things. It's a matter of how you design for it. I won't get into urban design issues right now, but basically giving you a flavor of the fundamentally different ways in which we are thinking about this whole issue. Nonetheless, it may already be too late to change some, to arrest some climate change. And unfortunately, the entire debate has now been hijacked almost by the mitigation part of things. We have to think about adaptation, particularly a country like India has to think about adaptation. And so, I mean, by the way, we should be thinking about adaptation all the time anyway, even without any human intervention. You know, global climate does change. In fact, the very first civilization that India created, which is the Harappan civilization, probably the first urban civilization in the world, collapsed because of climate change. So this happens anyway, and we have probably, through human contribution, probably sped up this process. But adaptation has got to be a very, very important part of the story. And we've got to pay attention to this because nobody is paying attention to it. But there are many things that we can do. But we have to be careful about what we adapt to. The reason I'm saying this is that there is a tendency about in this sort of field to make linear extrapolations of what climate change could be like. Unfortunately, if you look at the last 200,000 years of climate change, these are highly nonlinear events. And therefore, it's entirely unclear to me whether India will end up with more monsoon rain or less monsoon rain, or some combination thereof. Anybody, no matter how well great climate scientists they are and claim to know, they are lying. These are complex models with all kinds of different outcomes possible, which means that we have to prepare for this in a very intelligent way. You cannot do linear forecasting. Oh, the water levels will rise X and therefore this will happen, or, you know, and so on. In fact, we could have very, very different things happening on different coasts also. This requires actually rethinking many things. I'm just giving you one example. One of the things we'll have to rethink seriously is the kinds of grains we grow. Because the kinds of grains we grow currently require way too much water and fertilizers and other things. Oddly enough, India is also home to one of the most astonishing variety of grains that exist. Native grains, many of them actually, by trial and error, much better adapted to wild fluctuations in weather. Unfortunately, many of these grains are dying away because commercialization has meant that many of these native grains are no longer used. So just one example of something that we need to think about when preparing for climate change. We cannot get caught up just thinking about, you know, oh, we're going to have some more solar parks. That is part of the story, but it is an incomplete part of the story. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sanyal. Mr. Sinha, can I now invite you to speak?
Thank you, Shikha. But could you please repeat the question if you don't mind?
I don't mind at all.
Thank you.
So what can countries like India do to assert the fact that they need money to be able to mitigate and adapt? How can they attract these investments? And finally, and I'm not sure if you would like to touch on the third part of it, but what can India do to hold countries accountable in meeting their commitments?
Well, you know, there are two parts to the question that you asked. And first of all, I must salute all my panelists and all of you sitting here for being still alive at 11 o'clock at night after, I'm sure, a fairly long day. I'm sort of dropping off, but I'll try to answer the questions. I think the two issues you mentioned are obviously one around mitigation and the other is adaptation. Sanjeev spoke eloquently about the adaptation part, so I'm not going to go into that, and that's not also my area of specialization. So I'll confine my remarks to the mitigation aspect. Now, on the mitigation side, you know, the answer is actually very simple. All of these thought processes, multilateral agreements were all put together in an era when renewable costs were high, okay? And therefore, they required encouragement to get adopted or to get installed. And so therefore, the question was, who's going to finance this extra cost? You know, governments like India said, why should we be the guys financing it? Because we're not the guys who did all the polluting to begin with. And so therefore, you know, you Western world have to pay us for it because otherwise, you know, and you're the guys who did the polluting. So that's how this $100 billion, I guess, was a outcome of a significant negotiation that must have happened, and you know this number came up from somewhere. The reality is the number hasn't really worked out at all. I don't think that there's any pot that is sitting there with a label saying this is the $100 billion that was agreed. It is not like that at all. I don't know at all how much of that money has been earmarked or how much has actually flown in. But at some level, that question has actually become an irrelevant question now. And the reason I'm saying it's irrelevant now is because we have moved from the era when renewables were expensive to an era now where renewables are much cheaper and than conventional power is. And so therefore, whether we like it or not, willy-nilly, we moved into an era of transition. And that transition really is a third big energy transition. You know, we had the first transition into coal, then we had one transition into oil, and now we are transitioning from fossil fuels into renewable energy. If you look at what's happened in India over the last few years, actually the last literally few months and maybe over the last year, renewables are now significantly cheaper than fossil fuels. And so therefore the question is we really don't need any real financial support because in actual fact, these are very commercially viable projects now. And as long as India creates a good investment environment with solid PPAs, with solid offtake risk managed, you know, reasonable execution visibility, you will have as much capital and more than you want coming into the country. And that's really what we've seen happening over the last few years, that, you know, we've had a lot of foreign capital coming in. If you look at most of the renewables installations in India, a lot of them are funded by not foreign government money, but by foreign private money. Whether it's private equity firms, strategic investors, or other types of investors, sovereign wealth funds, multilaterals, etc. So the reason this money is coming is because investing in India in renewables is attractive. And that's the best way in which to attract more and more investments. And India so far has done a fairly good job of making sure that the environment is conducive. And the three things have happened. Number one, we had a situation where we had a national solar mission set up about 5-6 years ago. When this current government came in, they totally resized the targets to a whole different level altogether. So that gave people visibility that this market is going to be a big market going forward. And in actual fact, India is now pretty much the third largest or the second largest market in the world, depending on, you know, China's clearly way out there. But between India and the US, there's a fairly close situation in terms of who's second and who's third. And I think in a good year or a good day, India would be the second largest market. And that's a pretty significant, I think, accomplishment for India. The second thing is that we've moved into a very transparent auctioning mechanism so that new capacities are allocated based on a transparent auction. So there's no hanky-panky, there's no coal allocation kind of stuff going on in the background. And so that has also made it very easy for a lot of foreign capital to come in. So we've done done a lot of positive things in this sector. And I think that now the big advantage that India has is that our energy consumption right now is very low. And so therefore, even if we add more and more new renewable capacity, it's not going to be replacing existing fossil fuel capacity. It's going to be additive to it. It's going to be meeting incremental demand. And if you think about it, the Indian government's target right now is basically to have, under the Paris Agreement, 40% of our capacity coming from renewable energy by the year 2030, right? And today our total installed capacity is 330 gigawatts of all energy, right? Which, by the way, was China's capacity 17 years ago. Okay, China had exactly the same capacity as we have right now 17 years ago. But today, they are 5 times of India's size. So in the last 17 years, they've created 4 additional, as much capacity as they had at that point in time, and as much as India has now. Now, India's per capita consumption of energy is very low. It's only 1,000 kilowatt hours per year, per capita, which is about a third of the global average. So it's quite conceivable that we'll actually move up to become the second highest in the world. I mean, the second, double our capacity from 1,000 to 2,000, which will still be only, 2/3 of the global average. But if that happens, it'll mean that we'll need enormous amounts of new energy capacity, and most of that is going to come from renewables. So the market is enormous, and we all know that foreign capital rushes in if the market is there and the returns are there. And so all we have to demonstrate is that the returns are going to be there. And then, in actual fact, the $100 billion number is going to become irrelevant. It already is, because there's going to be more than enough, commercial capital running in. And not just foreign, but also domestic capital. So I think that on the mitigation side, certainly on the renewable side, I don't think that this number is something that we should worry about too much. I don't think that we need to assert it to anybody, anywhere, at any point in time. We are, as long as we have a good market, which we do, as long as we have a good investment environment, which we do, I think automatically things are going to work out, and we're going to get as much capital that we require. I think at this point, people are hungering to invest in large markets like India. So, and I'm sure Sean will talk about what's happening on the bond side. But whether it's equity or debt, our view is that there's sufficient capital available for funding all of our requirements going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. That's actually a really good segue for me to move to Mr. Kidney. You're the CEO of Climate Bonds Initiative that's dedicated to mobilizing the 100 trillion bond market for climate action. You serve as a member of the European Commission's high-level group on sustainable finance, co-chair the India Green Bond Council, and are a member of the UK Green Finance Task Force. So like Mr. Sinai said, there's no pot of money there. There's no Marshall Plan coming to our rescue. So how can developing countries meet their investment needs? What's really required? What are the checks and balances in the financial and political systems that can induce and encourage climate spending?
Well, that's a big question. Look, I just have to start off picking a bone of Sanjeev, if you don't mind. We can say that it's not all too certain about climate change, but look, there's a risk factor here. I come from a risk world. If all your engineers and all your climate scientists around the world, apart from a few people who never had any peer-reviewed literature, are saying this is happening...
No, I think you misunderstand what I'm saying. It is happening. I'm just saying that half the problem is that you have these linear forecasts. By the way, I run many of those models and set them up. Okay. So I know how well or badly they run. And I'm telling you, we are going through climate change. That is true.
Okay.
But I am saying that there is a serious problem with non-scientists taking that data and linearly forecasting and say they know what's going to happen. I'm just telling you, we don't know.
True.
Be absolutely clear that there's a very wide range of things that could happen. We could even end up with the world becoming cooler, incidentally. That's
the UK will become cooler.
That's a possible outcome. So the reason I'm making this point is that way too many non-scientists take this data, become activists, and then try to use that for linear policy outcomes, which are actually dangerous. That's the reason I made that point.
Maybe we need to get down to the weeds of what the policies you're concerned about are there. But, I'm going to say, on the balance of probability, based on what people are seeing is, we are looking at a catastrophic future for the planet. And on the balance of probability, on a risk factor. And that's a catastrophic future for India in particular, on the balance of probability, with many possible options. We could be hit by a meteor.
Absolutely.
We could be hit by a meteor.
It could be.
It could
All
be.
I'm trying to say is I am just very concerned about this thing. For example, just to give you, if you look at the last 200,000 years of data, one of the odd things is if the world becomes warmer, India actually gets heavier monsoons, not weaker. So that's completely different from what most of the data, most of the discussion is about. But you are on all the same time, of course, have mass inundation on the coastlines. And by the way, some parts of India would get less rain and others would get a whole lot more rain. So I totally agree that there is a problem. I simply am pointing out that the range of outcomes that are possible in that are very, very wide. And any self-respecting chaos theory modeler, which is what they should be for this, will tell you that that is true.
Now, we just staged this to wake you up late at night, of course. A bit of an argument is always important. Where we do agree thoroughly is the prescription around in India. Whilst there is a mitigation agenda, we need clean energy. We don't need it for mitigation just. We need it for air pollution in Delhi. It's not just agriculture, it's also energy systems. We need electric cars so we get diesel and fumes out of the air. There's many co-benefits, health benefits, that we now understand from China's transition the last 20 years, India has the opportunity to avoid. Now, unfortunately, it's not avoiding it of air pollution in Delhi now, which is the world's worst air pollution, having just come from Beijing a couple of weeks ago. I can tell you it's worse here. We can fix that relatively quickly with some changes. That's why Renew is so important. That's why these inventions are so important. There is a job around mitigation. But because of the nature of India and its exposure to these risks, resilience is really, really critical. And this is where we are 100% on the same page. Now, there's going to be coastal resilience. You've mentioned flooding. Mumbai will be underwater, I think, by about 2050 at the moment, or large chunks of it, based on what we're expecting to happen globally. Agriculture is going to become a real problem in India. There's going to be whatever volatility. Floods, heat are going to be extreme, whether it's more water or less water. And that's going to be a challenge for farmers to deal with. We need schemes, we need support for them to manage it. We're going to be thinking about the economic and social fragility that comes with that kind of volatility. That's going to mean we're going to have to work doubly harder on ensure that communities are resilient. And then what does that mean? Well, it means education. It means empowerment of women. It means, effectively, the Sustainable Development Goals. There is a 100% overlap, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, with what we have to do to create resilient societies. So I just alert that to you. But getting back to the point. First, $100 billion. I mean, ho, ho, ho. What a ridiculously small figure, given what we've got to do anyway. If we start talking about the sort of things we're talking about today, well, let me just throw a figure at you. We expect to be investing $6.3 to $7 trillion a year on infrastructure per annum over the next 15 years globally, with 70% of that in emerging markets. That's if the US gets its act together and finally does some planning. And if it doesn't, it'll be a greater percentage in emerging markets. That infrastructure needs to be climate mitigation focused and resilient. That's where the green comes in. It's part of it. We need to build railway lines that don't, as they did recently in Australia, buckle in the heat of unusually severe heat, which never been recorded before. There are risks in most tropical countries around that sort of thing. We need to be ensuring that that infrastructure creates the sort of cities that we want to live in that aren't going to be filthy and polluted, learning from China, etc. As Sanjeev says, we do, and as Suman says, we do actually have the capital, you know. I work in Europe, Australia, Japan, all these places have large pools of underutilised capital. You know, Siemens has 15 billion euros on deposit with the European Central Bank because it can't figure out what to do with it. I mean, I just personally think it would be unimaginative, but whatever, there are pools of capital. the institutional investors in Europe have 21% of their assets at the moment are invested in zero or negative rate bonds. No way to pay my pension, to say the least. No way to pay the pension of Europeans. So they need yield. So that's the opportunity for us. Whether this infrastructure is green or or these investments are general, it's an opportunity. The view is we have an opportunity to make them green to create a better future for us going forward. What does it mean? Well, I want to say, by the way, that this capital is unusual. This capital in Europe and the US and Australia and now Japan, where the government employees pension fund, $1.4 trillion under management, has come out and said that in the short order, 10% of all their assets will be shifted to environmental, social and governance investments. So it's happening in Japan as well. This capital wants green. It's been on record. We had at the UN's Climate Summit a couple of years ago, 60 trillion come out and sign rhetorical statements. They're not yet buying shares in Renew, but rhetorical statements saying they want to invest in green. So that's a positive thing. The green bonds market, there's brochures on the table, 150 billion last year, grew 70%. It'll grow between 70 and 80% this year with the help of India, is evidence of that demand. So this isn't abstract, this isn't theoretical. You give them risk yield products that suit their current requirements, often regulatory, and they will invest. That's what you know. And there is price movement in liquid currencies. One of our challenges in India is get the market liquid so we can uncover this price movement. So that's the plus side. What have we actually got to do? Well, the first thing we have to do globally in emerging markets is urban planning. 80% of this investment will be urban related in one form or another, including energy systems sitting outside that feed energy into cities. Mostly we're not now. We have some, in India, some fantastically ambitious programs. Smart cities, greenish, doing well in some parts, could be a lot greener. We haven't done enough in Delhi. In Mumbai, we're just building metros now. Very ambitious metro program, but it's a shadow of what's been done in Shanghai and Shenzhen and Beijing. We need to be doing triple the current planning of metros in Mumbai that we've got on the table, and ditto in Delhi and other major cities. These are things that we can do because the capital's there, albeit with some financing models that need a little bit of work. But it's planning. Secondly, it's governance. We have a big challenge with urban management in this country, which people haven't been used to accountability to accounts in many places around this country. We need to kind of shift into a mode where the financial credibility of urban governments and the institutions associated with them, water utilities and so on, become more transparent, more visible, and able to be inspected by investors so that they can then raise money from investors within the master plan from the centre, of course. But it's one of the things we're going to have to do. In agriculture, we need to be thinking of fresh and innovative ways to get those services to farmers to allow them to be resilient. That will need things like insurance products. We've got hardly any, compared to other countries, adequate insurance products for farmers when there are these stresses, floods and insurance. We need to grow the insurance sector for them and link it to weather reporting and weather monitoring and weather forecasting and climate forecasting. In the US now, there are services available where farmers can get intimate forecasting hectare by hectare across their farm based on soil type and everything, predictions about what kind of crops to plant, given the predictions for the next summer, and tied to it, insurance payouts that they get instantly if the projections fail. That is, if they're told to plant wheat and the wheat doesn't come through, they get an insurance payout like that. Now that is a tool for resilience. Imagine this working across Punjab. That would be fantastic. There are things like this around the world that we can bring to India and then use some of India's key skills, engineering, IT, to make happen going forward. From my point of view, the short term that we need is deal flow. We just need more deals. I've got investors crying out for green bonds. They're not crying out for risky green bonds, although I will say Renew's green bond, when they did it, wasn't exactly investment grade, and it sold like hotcakes, from what I recollect, Sumant, as is Greenco and so on. So there does seem to be appetite there. But we're after big, chunky things. We need help in putting together large deals or corporations to bring this to the table. This is how we get the capital flowing internationally. Domestically, we have a problem. We have more than enough capital in theory in India to finance this transition, but it's in the wrong places. It's in gold, it's in property, it's not in productive enterprises, it's not in liquid instruments either. In fact, we have all of this informal sector out there too, saving sector, which isn't being brought into the formal sector, which we need programs to do it. So in the medium term, the medium to long term, of course, we need to be looking for even greater efforts by the centre, which is, I have to say, done admirably in the last few years on this, but greater efforts to reform our capital allocation systems and look for ways of avoiding the capital allocation mistakes that economies like I come from, Australia, have made, which is vast slabs of capital sitting in dead property investments. We can't afford that. We need that capital going to productive enterprise and solutions to this particular change. In the short term, guys, door open. We're running an event in April. We're bringing green bond issuers to London and Paris to meet investors. Sumant, I'd love you to come. We have about a dozen in our sites at the moment. We're doing this regularly. The investors are there. They want to talk. We just need to package the deals and bring them forward and make this happen faster. I say faster because I do think there is a reasonable risk of catastrophic climate change. May not happen, lots of other options, and we might as well move quickly with alacrity to fix it. If we do fix it, well, what do we lose? We get cleaner air, we get cleaner water, and by the way, we leapfrog all of China's problems. Hey, what's to lose?
Win-win all around, and a shopping spree in April, I believe. Thank you for that, Mr. Kidney. It's interesting what's emerging over here, where resilience is important, ensuring that resilience is important, especially with an urban plan coming up in India, an urban policy, excuse me, coming up. We have projects, they're bankable, there's money there. So what's the missing link? If there was one challenge that you could sort of highlight as being the big obstacle in being able to move forward into a clean transition, what is taking our disruptive transformation as long as it's taking us? Would you like to start? I'm asking all of you. What's the one big challenge that you think really needs to be taken care of? Because the money is there, it's in the wrong places, the projects are there, the intention is there, the policy is there.
Well, you know, as far as India is concerned, and I'll confine my remarks to India, and again, I'll confine my remarks to the renewable energy side because that's the side that I deal with. I think the biggest problem in India right now, in some ways, is the off-taker risk issue, in that we sell all of our power to this thing called the distribution company. And that distribution company is owned mostly by state governments. And unfortunately, if you look at the power sector in India, then over the last 25, 27 years since our reform process started, except for the generation side, we really haven't had any real reforms in the rest of the sector. It's been piecemeal and so on. And even our regulatory process is not really truly as independent as it needs to be. So I think unless we change really what we have on the distribution side, unless we reform that, unless we change that, unless we actually improve the entire interface to the end consumer, you know, you will not have a situation where, you know, offtake risk is adequately protected. And if that is not adequately protected, then obviously cost of capital is going to be high. And I don't know who was the person who made that point about, I think you made the point about cost of capital. You know, if you look at, for example, of course, there are many other reasons for cost of capital in India to be high. But in the Middle East, which has very similar capex issues and similar radiation levels as India does, the cost of solar in the Middle East now per unit has come down to about 2.5 cents. In India, it's still about 5 to 6 cents or thereabouts, right? And so really the only difference is the cost of capital and the offtake risk issue. So that's something that if we can bring it down, if we can deal with it, if we can actually do true reforms in the power sector, and why should the power sector, which is one of the biggest sectors, you know, in terms of the country, why should that be something which just misses the entire reform bus? So I think, of course, Sanjeev is sitting right next to me, so he can throw light on what the government is doing or not on this issue. But, you know, that's needed. That certainly needs to be reformed and looked at. Thanks.
See, many of the things that need to be done don't need to be done specifically for climate change related or power sector related issues. Many of these things are generic problems of doing business in India problems. A stable regulatory environment, problem for any, if you want to make soap, it's also a problem. Cost of capital, also a problem. Enforcement of contracts, something I talked about last night as well, huge problem. So there is a wider issue of general governance that is an issue that is not specifically related to climate change related issues, but obviously also impinges upon it. So I think that is a major issue that we need to think about. Secondly, I think there are a whole range of things that need to be done which are not specifically need to be brought under the I mean, it's very often brought under climate change, but frankly, for example, improving our cities needs to be done anyway. Again, not related to climate change, but it would be great to have better cities and to have them more efficient because, we are an energy scarce country and therefore we'd like to use as little of it as possible. So there are many, many things that we need to do irrespective of this issue of specifically climate change, because even in the environment space, not everything is climate change. So coming more specifically to the issue of climate change, I think, and where we started our discussion, I think it remains the case that the real impacts of the Paris Agreement still continue to be very, very disappointing. It may have been a great deal, but the real impact on it still is limited at best. We can still hope that it'll lead somewhere, but so far it's limited. But nonetheless, I think individual governments and technology are taking things forward. And Suman just gave a great example of what's happening in the solar space, where irrespective of deals, the technology and the business economics of it is making massive changes. So I think in many ways, simply for us in the government to create the background infrastructure and governance structures for people like him to go out there and do business would be, a big, big step forward.
I'm in furious agreement with Sanjeev, and I'm very pleased to be so. It's quite clear that there are critical things. I mean, the recent insolvency law, that I guess it's a year now, reform, critical reform, way overdue, very important. In fact, we're giving a briefing to India Green Bond Council about it tomorrow from one of the law firms because it's so vital to the renewable energy sector as well. Contracts law, absolutely. There is work to be done in some other sectors. There's work to be done around the design of solutions in areas which are still part of our ambition. National rail system, we're doing fantastic work with planning the future. Metropolitan rail systems, as I've said, long way to go. We're way behind. When I caught the Delhi Railway out to UP the other day, a couple of months ago, and I got on, and it was even tighter than a Shanghai railway, I have to say. It was fantastic that it was so well utilised, but it's also crazy there aren't more, aren't there? It's just absurd. And instead we get stuck in traffic jams for ages and ages and ages. So how do we finance those? Well, actually, this is an area where we can do a little bit of work and where the centre can actually help. In Hong Kong, NTR, which is a 75% owned government company, 25% listed, finances the subway development of Hong Kong through property development. It pays a dividend to the state. It doesn't take money from the state. So it raises capital. It buys the air rights from the government, develops massive shopping centres, so they're given height rights. There's a shopping centre, there are commercial buildings and apartments to the block, and it runs as a profitable corporation. The city, Mumbai, is as dense as Hong Kong. It's denser, I think, than Hong Kong. This model will work very well there and work in many other cities. In each of the silos we've got to look at, there's innovation. I don't mean innovation in terms of developing new ideas. I mean bringing ideas that aren't currently being adopted widely enough in India and spreading them. And that's actually one thing we can put some energy, some elbow grease, as we say in Australia, into. And I think we really need to. And on the back of that, of course, we'll see all sorts of financial flows and the engagement of investors. Water planning. Whilst we have the Ganges Valley Commission slowly but surely developing its plans, we haven't given enough thinking to the extent to which water infrastructure can be used as power for batteries. You know, globally, 98% of power storage is in pumped hydro. So we've been thinking about it, but really we should be aggressively thinking about it. Whenever we build water storage anywhere, we should be thinking this is a battery and create it as a battery, 2-level dams, not 1-level dam, things like that. There's a bunch of things in silos that we've got to advance thinking about. CEW is doing some very interesting work on this, I have to say. It's one of the reasons we're partnering with them. How do we promote those ideas? How do we get them beyond the top, the smart cities, slowly but surely developing them? You know, let me be clear. When I go around the world, I say to people, India is fantastic because of the ambition that is now pervading the government and pervading infrastructure plans. It is an ambition that every country needs to have, followed by a government that follows through on it. This is what's needed in every part of the world. So it's a thrill to be here for that reason. That doesn't mean we can't do a hell of a lot more, and that's what we've got to do.
Yeah, I'd like to react to what Sumant has said. So yes, risk is a priority issue, definitely, and off-taker risk is one of them. I think there are at least 3 categories of risks that we have to address. There are risks that are that simply come out of misperception, and there are a lot of misperception of risks for investment in developing countries in renewable energies. Because we lack a good track record, we don't have the data. And I mean, people assess the risk with a mental map which comes from the previous decades. In an era of scarcity of energy, high prices of energy, centralized infrastructures for energy, it's a totally different world in which we are now. With super abundant, potentially super abundant energy, super cheap energy, decentralized, but highly capital intensive. So it's a different world, and we must change the perceptions and the mental map here. So there are misperceived risks, there are risks that can be reduced, mainly the policy risks. And enforcement of contracts is, of course, a major issue. One of the things on which we are working with countries of the Solar Alliance is that a certain number of rules could be enshrined actually in an international arrangement. And for certain reasons that would help fast-track development of solar projects and investment in countries which have a very, let's say, difficult legacy in terms of judicial system, legal system, etc. An international arrangement is paradoxically the most flexible and simple way to overcome this challenge. And there is a third category of risks. These are the risks that cannot be reduced otherwise and that have to be mitigated only at the beginning, especially the foreign exchange risk, because at the beginning it's very difficult to act on this one. And this is precisely the reason why we need a risk mitigation instrument to tackle those risks. And if I may, apart from the risks, I think there is also a problem in the way the market is designed and structured. Just have a look at the numbers we are talking about. According to the International Energy Agency, if we are to keep the increase of temperature below 2 degrees, for the solar sector only, we need at least 2.5 trillion US dollar investment by 2030. If we want to implement the INDCs to the Paris agreements, it's half of that amount, $1,200 billion. Let's face the fact that the market is not organized today in a way that we can finance this amount. On a daily basis, it's not possible. And especially because assets in renewable energy are much smaller than big infrastructure, nuclear infrastructure, hydropower infrastructure. So the financing is different. So we must organize the market in a different way, with portfolios of projects, with common platforms, etc. So this is a big issue. And if I may add just one word also regarding what Sumant said, what you said about the situation in India is certainly absolutely true, but I think we must bear in mind that the situation is very different in many countries with a lot of renewable energy resource, a lot of energy needs, and no policy frameworks, etc. And this is where the Solar Alliance come into place. It's not about the Indian market. I mean, the Indian market here is a leader. It is an example. It is something to be emulated. So the Solar Alliance, it's not about India, sorry to say so, but it's really about leading other developing countries on this path. I have a last remark, but maybe I stop here, and if we have time, I come back.
Maybe we can ask some.
Yeah, I think Ms. Pascal would like to.
Yeah, and just like to follow up on some of those things. In a lot of countries, in a lot of the developing world, the success or failure of finance for creating resilience is a byproduct of existing geopolitical relationships. And I'm going to go back to the South Pacific, first of all, because they're countries that are considered among the most vulnerable in the world. And second of all, they're a priority region for Prime Minister Modi for a range of reasons. And they're a location where Indian engagement and intervention in this sector could be extremely helpful. And I'll explain exactly why. If you take a look at the case of the Kingdom of Tonga, which again is a very small place, it's about 100,000 people, they put together a Tonga energy roadmap to get to 50% renewables by 2020. They were cross-sectoral, they dug deep into their own economy, they figured out exactly what they needed. And then New Zealand, who's their primary development partner, came along and said, actually, you don't need any of that. What you need is solar power provided by the state-owned enterprise of New Zealand, Meridian. We've never done any solar in the Pacific, but don't worry, we're the ones that have to do it for you. And not only that, you need to take out a $25 million loan to pay us to do it. The World Bank got involved and said, actually, this isn't such a great idea. Maybe you shouldn't do it. But the New Zealand foreign minister at the time used a lot of personal pressure on Tongans, including visa threats to withhold visas, for a range of things, and forced them to sign a really restrictive deal that it took over a year for the Prime Minister of Tonga to even see, because the head of Tonga Power was a New Zealander. So it was between the New Zealand government and a New Zealander at Tonga Power. And it tied Tonga into a power purchase agreement that didn't lower their costs. Their power plant was so lousy, the Japanese had to come in later with about $5 million to put in the New Zealanders had put in mechanical switches. So there was a guy sitting in a chair checking the load to figure out when he could put in solar or not, and there was no batteries, right? So that is, and the reason that they did that only became evident about 2 years later, which is when the New Zealand government floated Meridian Power on the New Zealand Stock Exchange. And they wanted to be able to say, we've put solar power into the Pacific and it's raised the value of our stocks for this flotation. So no matter how much money you're flowing in, if you're dealing with geopolitical relationships like that, the geoeconomics are going to become distorted and your geophysical environment is still going to become unstable. Thank you.
Yeah, stories always tell us that fossil fuels aren't the only dirty fuel around. I have a request for questions from Varun Sivaram and Madhura Joshi. Are they still here? Yeah. Great.
I'll just talk loudly. I'm Varun Sivaram at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Sinha, it was a pleasure to host you at the Council in DC. My question is, thank you. My question is, you've mentioned the strong investment case that can be built for solar in India. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the integration challenges we'll face in the future. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory released a report showing that even at 10% of India's electricity generation, solar could produce over 80% of instantaneous supply in certain regions. How do you integrate this amount?
Yeah, obviously that's an issue that has to be looked at. I don't know the report that you're referring to, so I can't actually comment on that specific statement. But I think the general feeling is that up to about 15% of renewables in the grid should be manageable. Now, there would be certain areas that have more, certain areas that have less. And so obviously the management of the grid will have to be looked at all points in time. But so far, whatever I've seen is that most of the distribution companies are being relatively prudent about it, in that they are trying to distribute solar across the whole state, for example. So in Karnataka, they have done bids on the basis of every district installing 20 megawatts. So across something like 60 or 70 districts in the state, they're making sure that every district has a 20 megawatt solar installation. And so in some ways, by dispersing it that much, you're actually reducing the problem, because you'll have load centers then closer by rather than being far away and then having to dispatch all this power long distances. So I think by and large, distribution companies are being prudent about this risk right now. The question is, how do you take it beyond 15%? Because we'll probably get to that number in the next 5 years or so. So we have a window of about 5 years in which we have to deal with this problem. Which is not saying that there may not be pockets of issues that may arise, but I think there won't be a systemic issue as such. So we have 5 years to deal with this problem, and I think what the government is doing is they're building these green corridors to evacuate power from these large solar parks that are being built into load-bearing areas. So that is one. Secondly, they're trying to upgrade the ability of the state load dispatch centers to manage all this power and make sure we don't have things like mechanical switches and stuff like that. And thirdly, I think that eventually there is going to have to be a much better management of the grid in terms of both ancillary services on the one side, which we just don't have right now, and also time of day pricing. So I think between both of those, which both these markets need to be developed. And my big fear is that renewables are going to happen so fast because the economic rationale for it is so strong now that we're going to sort of find ourselves in a situation where if policymakers don't keep up with all of this change that is going to happen, then it is going to exactly lead to the problems that you mentioned. So far, I haven't seen it happening, and I see the government taking adequate steps. But if there's anything more unplanned or faster than expected, then that problem definitely could arise. So it's something that we have to be very, very alive to. But so far, all indications I have is that people are dealing with this issue. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to your session in DC.
Hi, I'm Madhura Joshi. I'd like to thank the panelists for a really enriching discussion. Climate finance is a topic which I'm interested in, but no matter how much I listen to it, always leaves me with more questions than perhaps clarifications. So if you could please bear with a few of my questions that I had. The first question is to Mr. Kidney. I just wanted to understand, with the green climate bonds, I think for India, it is a big market, and it practically sells itself. But will these kind of private bonds also go to smaller developing nations with smaller, perhaps, capacity, smaller markets? If not, how do we meet these trillions and trillions of dollars? The numbers are sort of mind-boggling, and I can't even, there are different estimates every time I look at a new paper. So for mitigation and adaptation, there are trillions and trillions of dollars required. And some of these may not be as attractive investments as, Indian markets may be. So that's my first question. Second question, I would basically like to thank Dr. Pascal. I'm not sure, I think I missed your intervention because our other talk went on for a little longer, so I'm not sure what was the first part of it. But one thing that I found missing in this panel was any conversation around governance of climate finance, primarily for the reason and the example that you raised at this point of time. With regards to governance of climate finance, I had two questions. One is, what is to basically stop things as what you mentioned, where you have big multilateral multilateral agencies, not companies, or private finance, or basically bilateral aid dictating where the finance should be, where the money should be invested, just so that it looks good for people they have to answer to. One, that. Second, what is to basically stop green washing of basically normal finance into more attractive sort of investments. While I vehemently believe in co-benefits, that co-benefits argument sometimes can be extended to everything. which it is. So how do we stop green washing of basically climate finance? And the last question is a very basic clarificatory question to Mr. Werling. I just wanted to understand a little better what you said by Green Climate Fund may support some activities or fund some activities under the International Solar Alliance. So will the GCF give money to ISA, which in turn will give money to solar projects? So is International Solar Alliance then an accredited body? Or is it that ISA curates these projects, which then presents it to GCF? So just to get some clarity on that. Thank you very much.
No, I'm afraid we can't take any more questions. Please.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. Smaller nations, ISA. We've been supporting the CRM facility. It'll be de-risking for some of these investments. We need to now move on to aggregation solutions. By the way, we need to do this in India too, of distributed solar and smaller solar. We've got a lack of intermediaries between a lot of small lending and capital markets. Some of those banks are some of those intermediaries, of course, and they're doing stuff, but there's scope for a lot more creative solutions here. And that's one of the things we've been discussing internationally with ISA and the Terawatt Alliance is how could we do things to support multiple countries, including all the foreign exchange challenges, but luckily we have TCX, a foreign exchange hedging company, as part of this coalition. So we're optimistic that there's going to be some developments there as an example, not the only one. In Kenya, where we're working at the moment, just in that country, there's no one who's got really the power to issue bonds at any kind of scale. So there, we're doing a cooperative bond issuing facility for the banking industry. So all the banks will see the loans in for solar, for green homes, and issue bonds on a national basis supported by the central bank. So there's options. Lastly, on governance, note that in India, most of the bonds issued recently have been certified under an international apparatus which has got a whole protocol about supporting the green credentials and reviewing the green credentials. The International Capital Markets Association Green Bonds Principles does a bit of that as well. And I think Renew actually got a review under the green bond principles when they did their green bond. So there is emerging international architecture. It needs a bit of oomph from government, and SEBI's already given that here. And the RBI has a review looking into green finance and what their role is going to be going forward. A lot of that will be around governance. So I think that's sorting itself out, slowly but surely.
Yeah, it's a very good question on the governance thing. So the story that I told you is a byproduct of an existing geopolitical relationship. I gave you the example in that sector. I can give you examples in the transport sector, in the telecom sector, all those different sectors. So, which is why I think it's important for India to know these stories, because if India wants to get involved, it can't do what it did yesterday, which is do a track 1.5 with Australia and ask Australia to help them go into the Pacific Islands. Right? There's a problem with those pre-existing relationships. And ultimately, it's going to be bad for Australia and New Zealand when those countries start to have very serious problems and China comes in with a loan, which is essentially what's happening all over the region already. It's not good for India either. So it's not just, this is the tip of a very large iceberg of a problem, which is why what I bored people with in my first thing was you need to look at geopolitics and geoeconomics and geophysical change in conjunction if you're going to find a rounded solution. Thank you. Oh, and just by the way, the big problem that small countries have often is they don't have think tanks. So there's nobody for them to engage with. So if India really wants to help, it'll help a lot of the smaller countries set up think tanks so that they can have their own voice on these issues.
Okay, thank you for your question. So first, this money from the GCF would not be used to finance projects in Solar Alliance countries, but would be used as a guarantee to de-risk investment and catalyze investment, private capital in those countries. And if the decision is made, it would be actually a kind of victory for two reasons. First is that certainly the most useful thing that the GCF can do, the most efficient thing that the GCF can do, is to provide guarantees. And it has not done so so far. So if the Solar Alliance provides the GCF with the opportunity to do something really transformative It will be a big victory for the Indian government. And second, of course, if this mechanism is funded only a few months after the entry into force of the agreement, this would also be a victory. Now, to be very concrete, the ISA is not an accredited entity to the GCF, and in any case, the member countries are the ones who apply. So the money would go through an accredited agency of a member country. Just one word about system integration, because it's a very important question. Actually, it is possible to manage a lot of variable renewable energy in a grid. I think in Denmark now they have something like 35% of electricity coming from variable renewable energy. But you have to totally rethink and restructure your grid. And this costs a lot. If you decarbonize the system, it has to be decarbonized, but also digitalized and decentralized. So it's a totally new system. And this is the reason why you have to lower and lower the cost of power generation. Because if you want the total costs, power generation plus the distribution system, to be acceptable and to be competitive, given that the fact that the cost of the distribution is going to be high, the cost of generation has to be really low. So when Sumant said now renewable are competitive vis-à-vis fossil fuels, yes, it's good. But we have to go much lower. And this is the reason why the cost of capital here is critical.
Thank you. I know that there were some more questions from the audience, but I'm sure my panelists will be kind enough to speak to you once we're closed here. It's impossible to conclude a panel like this, but I would like to share a quote from one of my favorite storytellers, Nancy Duarte. She says that the future is not a place we're going to, it's a place we're going to create. And for me, the big takeaways from this session have been that we need increased trust in the international environment on climate change. We need increased reforms that mitigate risks for investments. And we definitely need power coalitions that don't undermine sovereignty, which again goes back to the trust factor. With that, I'd like to thank you all for being here, and I'd appreciate a big round of applause for my panel for being stellar.